Hello and welcome to Seed Speaks. My name is Sonia Begeman. I'm the editorial director here at Seed World Group. And I'm so excited because today I get to talk with a panel of experts about a really popular, really exciting, moving topic, and that is new breeding techniques as they pertain to agriculture. So joining me today is Jennifer Hubert with CropLife Canada. And I have Fanli Chou with the American Seed Trade Association and Garlich von Essen with Euroseeds. Thank you all so much for joining me today. We will dive right into the topic at hand because I know it's one that is extremely exciting. So, when we talk about new breeding techniques, each of the countries has taken a very different approach in how they're defining these breeding techniques and how they're regulating these techniques and just really how they're approaching it in general. So I think I'll start with you, Fanli. How is the United States approaching new breeding techniques, from kind of a high level? I know there's a lot of detail there, but at a high level, what's the approach the United States is taking?
Sure. Thank you, Sonia. So the United States, we have 3 agencies that are involved in kind of regulating these products. And each 3 agencies have been tasked by the White House through many administrations to take a look at their current regulatory processes and their policies and see how they can be updated to reflect these new breeding techniques that are coming on board. And USDA was the first out of the gate, and they finalized their regulations, and they looked at these new breeding techniques and the product that they could be developed using them, and exempted certain product that could have been done through conventional breeding. So now in the US, we're waiting for the Environmental Protection Agency and FDA to do similar updates and revisions to their policy guidances. So last year, the EPA put out their proposal, which is similarly aligned with USDA's, and we're waiting to see how that will be finalized. And then lastly, we're waiting to see how FDA will address these. So in the US, we're looking for all 3 agencies to revise their policy and to have consistency between the 3 different agencies.
It's interesting. The US has taken a very forward approach almost. They're letting scientists do a lot and do more, it seems like. Where Garlich, I don't know if it's exactly like that in Europe. Can you tell me a little bit more about how Europe is approaching new breeding techniques and their definition and regulations?
Well, I think that Europe is not that different as regards the principal approach. Most parts of the world have looked at their existing rules and regulations for genetically modified organisms and have been looking whether or not they should be applied in the same manner or differently to those new technologies. So where do they fit? Do they fit with these genetically modified organisms as we used to know them? Or do they rather fit with earlier breeding methods, classical crossing selection and other breeding methods? And I think what everybody has realized is it's not that simple, because what we are actually talking about is indeed technologies that can be used in very different ways and can achieve very different kind of products. So I think the different aspect indeed for Europe was that our existing rules for genetically modified organisms specifically look at the technology used. So once you use a technique of genetic modification, all steps that follow later, so up to the final fruit that you might produce, that product will continue to stay a genetically modified organism. Even if you breed it out at some point in time, it doesn't matter, it still remains a GMO. And with these products, we have now, I think, started the discussion, well, we need to look more at the product that results from a technology to say, where does that product fit? And that discussion is actually really ongoing now in Europe. What I can say is that Europe has realized that the old rules do not work for these technologies. So we are at least at a point now where the Commission has initiated a new legislative proposal that will still take some time to elaborate, to take account indeed of the specificities of these technologies and their resulting product to get to a proper set of rules and regulations for these specific techniques.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Jennifer, I know that CropLife Canada, Canada itself hasn't, Health Canada is still kind of defining things and still kind of making some decisions. So what are you hearing about the comments that have been made, or about, are they leaning one way or another? what's the conversation right now in Canada about these new breeding techniques?
Yeah, so we've been having conversations about the regulations in Canada for quite some time, even before new breeding techniques became the big thing. And so Canada has a product-based approach. It's pretty unique in the world and in how they look at it. It's always been product-based, regardless of the technology. And with that, that means any technology can be regulated, even conventional breeding. And we have seen, although rare, conventional breeding products go through the same system as a GMO would. Now, that we think is the most science-based way to do it. And as Garlich stated, they're going to be looking towards kind of looking more at the product than the technology. But that comes with challenges in itself. There's a lot of ambiguity, and how do you draw the lines, and how do you define what products come in? And that's been a real challenge in Canada. And there was a survey done by Stuart Smythe out of the University of Saskatchewan a few years back, asking breeders how they felt about the regulations. Were they clear? And we got some interesting results back from that survey, where a lot of breeders were not clear as to whether or not their conventionally bred products required assessment and required a pre-market assessment. They were avoiding certain breeding programs to avoid novelty. Some were taking research outside of Canada because they were so uncertain about whether it would be novel in Canada. And Canada is really the only place in the world that has ever done a pre-market assessment on conventionally bred products. So we already had uncertainty for conventional breeding. Bring in new technologies, and there was even greater uncertainty as to where they would fit. So conventional breeding rarely triggers. We're looking at 30 products out of thousands of new varieties developed. How will the new techniques fit in? Will they be more like GMOs, where every GMO has required an assessment in Canada? Or will it be more like conventional breeding? So ultimately, we determined the old rules were also not working in Canada, and we need clarified rules to better determine what type of product requires an assessment. So Health Canada had some consultations over the past year, and came out with a proposed draft guidance, new guidance, back in March. And they held a 60-day public consultation period that closed in May. And we're expecting that those will come out soon. And we're quite pleased with what they came up with. It was quite clear. It was much more clear as to what type of products would trigger an assessment. The CFIA, so like the US, we have 3 departments that we're dealing with. We have Health Canada that does food, and CFIA that does feed and environment. So the environment group also came out with some new proposed guidance. There's a few areas there that I think the industry has still some remaining uncertainty about, but it is improved from before. And they're consulting right now. That consultation is actually going to close just in the next week and a half or so. And then we still need to look at revising the feeds guidance. But no regulations have to be changed. It's all policy within the current regulations, because our regulations have flexibility to deal with it at a product level.
Mm-hmm. It just speaks to the complexity of this whole situation. You know, science is moving so quickly. How do regulators and how do policymakers keep up? I think that's a really big challenge for every country that's dealing with these new techniques, these new technologies. Family, I'm curious. So the United States has taken this approach that says, you know, it doesn't have to be called a GMO if it fits certain criteria and things like that. So I assume then that breeders are very openly trying to use this technology and things like that. So my question for you is the technology still too new to know if it's going to be successful, or are we seeing successes in the United States based on, you know, their ability to try out new things?
I think it all depends how you define success. So if you look at the scientific literature, so these are kind of proof of concept, early stage research and development, you can see these suite of technologies, and we're not just talking about one, we're talking about a number of different technologies that's been used by researchers in a variety of crops in a variety of ways, and trying to develop a variety of traits. So in that sense, it has democratized the type of crop that's been used, to democratize the kind of traits that people want to develop. So that to me is clearly a success. And these tools are used in a very scientific discovery mechanism that helps the breeding community writ large. So that's a success. So whether these products would translate to a commercial product and become a commercial success, I think there's still some uncertainty. As we, in the US, we have 3 agencies, so we need that regulatory consistency around the 3 agencies. We're also not in isolation, an isolated economy. We are trading partners with Canada, one of our biggest trading partners. We have a lot of seed relationships with Europe. So the international harmonization or compatibility of these policies is really important to ensure that we have incentivizes commercial success. So I think at this point, the community as a whole is still waiting to see whether there's that regulatory predictability that's needed to be truly commercially successful, allowing it to use in a more democratic way across the variety of crops and a variety of entities that wants to be involved in bringing like innovative products to the market.
Mm-hmm. Finley, I'm glad you brought up the fact that we are an international market, because we actually just had a question come in from our audience from Alex Martin. And, she asked, each country's kind of taking a different approach to how they're, placing regulations or policies on new breeding techniques. But we're global. So EU trades with the United States, trades with Canada. Canada trades with everyone too. So, we're all one big happy family. What does this mean for trading? So I think, Garlich, I'll volley this question to you first. And that is, when we look at the way the US is doing things with new breeding techniques versus the way Europe's doing, they're a little bit different. Have there been any trade implications, any complications, or any extra hoops that people need to jump through, or extra boxes we need to check before we can send, soybeans or whatever to EU?
Well, I think for the time being, no. Because on the one hand, as Finley mentioned, the US is not ready with its regulatory framework for these technologies. So it has done some work, but it's not ready. And as also was mentioned, we don't really have products that are now commercially grown in any part of the world yet that would actually start entering our trade flows. So for the time being, I think we're still talking a bit of in a theoretical construct. But what we can, of course, predict, and that was already alluded to earlier, is that any difference, fundamental difference that we would have in the approach to these technologies and their resulting products between major trade regions would, of course, complicate things. So from the international seed federations perspective, as well as then us in the regional or international seed associations, we have always underlined that this is a very important element for us, that we have consistency of rules and regulations internationally, so that we have come to a defined or commonly defined approach of what falls where and what the rules and regulations will be like. They will probably slightly differ in the world. That's not the issue. But we shouldn't have, of course, products that are considered to be conventional in, let's say, Southern and Northern America, and they're considered to be a GMO in maybe the EU and parts of Asia. Then we start having serious issues. And that's not only true for the trade, but also when we look at one step earlier, so where we are responsible, is of course true also for the flow of seed and of plant breeding material. Seed is a global business. All our companies work in all parts of the world, move plant breeding material of all stages of development throughout the world to speed up breeding, gain time, improve qualities, and bring products to market at the right point in time in the right market. So also there, if the rules would differ, that would seriously complicate that movement of seed. So does Europe already see falling behind? I think what we have seen, like we saw many years ago with GMOs, that of course some companies have started in the wake of this uncertainty to rather go to other parts of the world with certain breeding programs. But most of those early stage breeding programs are laboratories, are greenhouses, so they're confined. So there actually the issue doesn't yet really materialize. That will change as soon as these technologies become indeed embraced across the sector across different species and different breeding programs, then obviously that would get a lot more complicated if we would have different rules.
Absolutely. Garlic, I think you brought up a good point here. It complicates things. Nothing's final yet. And I think that's also a really good point. There's still so much uncertainty, but there's the opportunity for some complication. And so, Jennifer, what's Canada? I mean, what have you heard the conversation being about trade, about, how do we regulate? How do we do things as it impacts trade of seed or of commodities, things like that?
Yeah, certainly for large commodity crops, the seed developers, they won't even launch in Canada until they have all the key export market approvals, unless it's something that can be stewarded and kept out of market channels easily and through stewarded programs. So certainly we're looking for pragmatic solutions globally that are not necessarily identical, but aligned, and where you can get through the regulatory system fairly readily without major costs of all the studies that have to go into it and the costs of going through the regulatory oversight program. So, we've seen like that can really shut things down. How this plays out from a regulatory point of view globally is going to have a huge impact on the diversity and the value of the traits that get introduced and the crops that they get introduced to. The small medium enterprises and public institutes, as Fanley was talking about, it's really democratizing the technology to allow them to use it. In the past, it's the technology, the GM technology has been very limited to multinational companies in large field crops, because that's the only way you can get the return in investment to cover the cost that it costs to bring the product to market and through the regulatory channels. So it's very important that we get this global regulatory system right in a way that can foster the innovation and foster these smaller developers and public institutes to be able to use the newer technologies. And we've seen a really good example. Argentina was the first country to come forward with clarified guidance on NBTs, where they would not be regulated as a GMO provided they met certain conditions. And what we've seen in the past 5 years, so that was introduced in 2015. And what we've seen in the past 5 years is a big shift from what we've seen previously with GMOs, where GMOs, it's 90% foreign multinationals that are making the applications. And with the NBTs, we're seeing less than 10% are the foreign multinationals. 60% are local and public researchers. So they're only able to do that because it's a more pragmatic regulatory environment.
That's always been one of the things I've found so exciting and encouraging about some of these new breeding techniques is it is accessible by regional and local companies. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a really interesting part of this. And Fanley, I'm curious from your perspective, when you look at new breeding techniques and their potential in the United States and beyond, what excites you most about this technology? I mean, what do you think the potential really is?
Well, I think right now, from scientific perspective, the potential is limitless, right? It's such it's a powerful research tool. It's a powerful predictive breeding tool. So in that vein, I think there's just a lot of excitement around the scientific community and the breeding community. I want to go back to something that Jennifer had said, was about, how Argentina and certain South American countries took the lead into kind of putting together this very pragmatic and what I would call risk proportionate regulatory approach. And I think, when we think about like these products are not treated as a GMO, that does not mean that they don't meet some certain safety standards. That just means they don't have to go through this extra hurdle of a GM regulatory approval. So I think that's really important to point out, that regardless of how plant varieties are introduced into the marketplace, they have to meet certain, both like a private sector and also public oversight, to make sure that they are safe. So what we're talking about here is rather they need to go through that extra hurdle of a GM regulation. So in that vein, even the policy development around the world is very, very encouraging. I think globally, we've had over 20, 25 years of experience looking at new breeding methods, right, all across the board, and what these products can bring and what kind of potential risks they may have been perceived to have. And we've had a great track record of bringing really safe and effective products to market. So I think both from a scientific perspective and a policy perspective, I'm very optimistic that this technology will have tremendous impact for our breeding community, for our farming community, and just in general from a global ag perspective.
It's very encouraging. And Garlich, I'm curious. I think it was actually a blog by Euroseeds that I read about this. The farm to fork potential initiative could actually open some doors for new breeding techniques to maybe not be defined as a GMO, or maybe there's some opportunity there to include that more in EU than before, is kind of the understanding I have from the blogs that I've read from you guys. Can you talk to me about what the climate initiatives that you guys have in the EU and farm to fork and so on, what that could mean for some of these new breeding techniques and new ways to advance science in EU?
Well, I think it is probably the understanding or the realization that those objectives that the EU has put forward in its so-called Green Deal, and under that Green Deal you have as one of the objectives the biodiversity strategy, and as one objective the farm to fork strategy, which in a short summary basically say we want to become greener. So we want to use less fertilizers, we want to use less pesticides, and so forth and so forth. So we want to become more environmentally friendly in agriculture. But at the same time, people realize, well, if you really want to have a significant reduction of crop protection products, well, what does that do to farm income? What does that do to the availability of produce? What does that do to prices for consumers and so forth? So the problem of the pests and diseases doesn't go away just because you define that you don't want to use pesticides anymore. So you need to look for alternatives. And I think we have managed over time to really convince people that indeed plant breeding should be looked at as a possible solution to some of those problems. We're not saying plant breeding or the new breeding techniques are the silver bullet that will resolve all issues. It probably is not the case. But it is a set of tools that you can use to improve things, to speed up things, which is a very important element of these new technologies, that they actually can speed up development processes. You know that time is indeed not a friend of plant breeders. It usually takes a long time to bring a good product to market, but we can shorten that time considerably with these new technologies. So I think people start realizing the Green Deal can become a reality only if we use science, technology, and progress. And new plant breeding methods are one very important element in that. We have calculations that progress in plant breeding is responsible for around about 70 to 80% of productivity gains over the past decades. And we expect that to grow in the absence of other inputs or in the restrictions of other inputs. So I think it will become even more important. And then indeed, people realize, well, if you ask people to speed up basically a regular car, you need to give those people a couple of tools to work on the motor. So you cannot do nothing. And these technologies are those tools that we need to speed up our cars.
Absolutely. I mean, climate change and this challenge is something that's not going away. So it certainly sounds like every tool in the toolbox is definitely welcomed. We had a question come in from our audience from Ashley Robinson, and Jennifer, I will volley this one to you. And that is kind of, if I'm someone who buys and eats food, why should I care about the different approaches to creating new varieties? Why do I care that you're using a new breeding technique or not?
I think that you don't need to, is my answer. You don't need to care how they're being developed. You need to know that all food is regulated and all food needs to be safe. And so really how they're developed, shouldn't matter. And that's why I think the product-based approach in Canada does make a lot of sense. It's really about the characteristics that you're impacting in the plant and what those are. Have you impacted a toxin or an allergen? Those are the things that you need to really care about, not whether you use gene editing or conventional breeding or GMOs, but what did you impact in the plant? And you know, a lot of these new breeding technologies kind of become the star of the show, but really the star of the show is today we have so much more knowledge and better ability to sequence plants and understand the DNA and the genes and how they function and what they do. And then these new tools come along that now that you like, these new tools are really useless without that information. You need to know, in order to make targeted changes with these really precise methods, you need to know what to change and why. And that knowledge has vastly expanded in the last 10 years, the ability to get that information and know exactly what you want to change. And then you have these precise tools that can come in and make that really precise change for you. But you have to know what you want to do. And that takes, you know, time and research.
Yeah.
Maybe if I may add one point here, why should you care? Because it may limit your access to food. If you, for example, if you would authorize the use of these technologies for the development of an allergen-free wheat, so thinking about the celiacs, no? The question whether that will become available and at what price and where will partly depend on how that is going to be regulated. It might well be that then certain food products will become available at cheap and affordable prices in certain parts of the world, and they will not be accessible in others. So should you care? Maybe you should, at least a little bit.
Yeah, I agree, Garlich. I think it's, you know, we're so lucky where we live to have that availability, accessibility, and affordability in our food, and that's not the case in many countries. So I think just having this, you know, in the US, perhaps we're lucky that, you know, if the regulatory hurdles are high, it's not going to impact our daily lives, like what I put on the table. In other places, this is really impactful because, as Garlich says, time is of the essence from a plant breeding perspective, and time is not a friend of plant breeders. So in this case, Sonia, as you mentioned with climate change, the climatic conditions under which we produce food is changing. So to have us provide the seed and the variety that can meet that, we need to match up in time. So we cannot afford to lose tools. And regulatory hurdles that are necessary from a protection goal perspective will help us lose those tools, and we can't lose those tools. And so I think from a global perspective, it's really important to have a consistent approach so that, you know, every corner of the world, every farmer of the world, every plant breeder around the world can have the same kind of access and availability to develop varieties that's important for that part of the world from a food security and food nutritional security perspective.
I think
Sorry,
that's
I think I might have missed part of that question. I answered it as, should you care if what method your food is produced with? No, but should you care how it's regulated? Yes. Exactly what Fanley and Garlich said.
Perfect. Yeah, it's so interesting. Doesn't matter, it's safe food, but what's the hurdles to actually getting that food to your plate? And I think that's what you guys are pointing out here. That's the big thing you should care about.
And I think, you know, Garlich, you said this at one of your talks that stayed with me for during my career, is that seed is one input we cannot replace. Without seed, we cannot grow anything. We cannot feed animals. We cannot have plant-based protein. So I think from that perspective, seed is the foundation, and we need to kind of make that seed as viable and as strong as we can when it's put in the ground. So these tools that are coming online is really helping us to do that, and really, you know, leveraging all the scientific advances Jennifer mentioned to help us be more predictive in our plant breeding. And so I think I care about how our food is made and what technology is used because it's so cool, it's so interesting, and it's just, you know, such an amazing discovery and application that has such a direct impact on our daily lives.
Absolutely. All right. Well, unfortunately, guys, that is all the time that we have for today. I have a long list of questions that I didn't get to ask. So I think we'll have to revisit this topic again soon.
We'll be back.
Sounds great. I'd love to hear each of your guys's, here's what a perfect regulatory system would look like, and all sorts of additional questions. So we'll be back and we'll get this going. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Fanley. Thank you, Garlich, for joining us today. I really appreciate your perspective. It was wonderful to hear. Thank you to all of our viewers for watching. Be sure to stay tuned next week when Ashley Robinson is joined by Ken Shulsky, Executive Vice President and CEO of CAST, and Joe Swartz, Director of McGill's University Office for Science and Society. They're going to talk about buzzwords in agriculture, and do they go beyond just marketing terms, or do they actually achieve the goals that they're said to achieve? I think it's going to be a really interesting and really dynamic topic. I hope you tune in next week, Wednesday at 12 o'clock Central Time. We'll see you then.